Have you ever wondered how many times a man can look death in the eyes before his soul begins to tremble? How much can courage truly endure when the world around him burns? Some men are remembered for the battles they won, others for the wars they survived. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who believes in human endurance. Because today, you're about to hear the story of the man who survived 7 battles and lived to remember them all. The year was 1808. Europe was a furnace of ambition, blood, and revolution. Napoleon Bonaparte's armies had spread like wildfire, and the world trembled under the sound of marching boots. Among the countless soldiers drawn into that chaos was a young man from Yorkshire, England, Thomas Hale. He was 20 when he enlisted in His Majesty's 33rd Regiment of Foot. His hands were calloused from the mills, his eyes clear and steady, his dreams filled with a sense of duty and adventure. The war in Spain had begun Britain's desperate struggle to push back the French in what history would call the Peninsular War. When Thomas's regiment landed on the rocky shores of Portugal, the air was thick with the scent of salt and gunpowder. The men whispered that Napoleon's soldiers were demons unstoppable, merciless, and invincible. But Thomas didn't believe in demons, he believed in orders. His first battle came near a village called Relica. It was August, and the sun scorched the hills like fire. The French had taken the high ground, and the British were ordered to advance uphill through musket fire. Thomas felt the ground shudder beneath his boots as cannonballs struck the earth, spraying dirt and bone in every direction. He saw men fall friends, boys he had laughed with the night before, but he kept moving. He fired his musket, loaded and fired again, his fingers working faster than his mind could think. Smoke filled his lungs, his ears rang with the scream of shells, and his body shook with exhaustion. Yet somehow he reached the ridge. When the French retreated, the battlefield was littered with the dead, and Thomas stood among the survivors, trembling, bloodied, alive. That was his first battle. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the dim glow of a dying fire, staring at his hands. They were black with powder and trembling. "This is what it means to be a soldier," his sergeant said quietly beside him. "You don't live through battles. You just survive them." Months passed. Battles blurred into marches, long, endless marches through the mountains of Spain. The British fought, retreated, and fought again. Hunger became a constant companion. But by 1809, a new campaign began Talavera. It was here that Thomas's courage would be forged in fire. The day began with cannon fire echoing through the valley. Thousands of men stood shoulder to shoulder in the rising heat. The French columns advanced in perfect rhythm, drums pounding like the heartbeat of war itself. When the first volley was fired, the world disappeared into smoke. Thomas loaded and fired until his musket barrel burned his hands. His regiment's colors, the flag they would die to defend, fell when the ensign was struck down. Without thinking, Thomas ran forward through the chaos, grabbed the flag and planted it on a captured French gun. For hours, he held that position as bullets tore through the air around him. When the battle finally ended, Thomas was found unconscious beside the tattered flag, his hands still gripping the pole. He had been shot twice, once in the arm and once through his coat, but the bullets had missed his heart. They said it was luck. Thomas thought otherwise. "Luck doesn't last," he said later. "Only men do." That was his second battle. 3 years later came Salamanca, 1812, the turning point of the Peninsular War. By then, Thomas was a seasoned soldier. His face had hardened, his humor turned quiet. The British forces under Wellington met the French on open ground. It was a battle of movement, speed, and cunning, one that would break Napoleon's hold on Spain. Thomas fought in the center. When a French shell exploded near him, the blast threw him into the air and buried him in earth and debris. His ears rang with silence, a deafening, empty roar. He dug himself out with bleeding hands, his leg broken, and found the field deserted. For hours he crawled through the smoke and corpses until he found a farmhouse where Portuguese peasants hid him. They nursed him back to life, and when he returned to his regiment, months later, the men called him the Ghost of Salamanca. They said death had missed him by inches. He said nothing. But sometimes when the campfires burned low, he would look into the flames and whisper, "I left too many behind." That was his third battle. By 1815, Napoleon escaped from exile, and Europe held its breath. The old soldiers were called once more. Thomas was among them, now 30, his hair touched with gray. The final confrontation awaited Waterloo. The morning of June 18th was soaked in rain. Mud clung to the soldiers' boots as they formed ranks. Across the valley, Napoleon's grand army stood like a dark wave ready to crash. When the drums began, the sound rolled across the fields like thunder. Thomas stood in a square formation, bayonet fixed. The French cavalry charged, a sea of horses and sabers glinting under the clouds. "Hold the line," came the order. The British square stood unbroken as the horses thundered forward. Men were trampled, crushed, sliced, but the line did not falter. Thomas fired, reloaded, stabbed, and held. When the French fell back, he was the last man standing in his row, surrounded by bodies and shattered weapons. His uniform was torn, bloodied, but his eyes were still calm. He had survived again through smoke, death, and chaos. That was his fourth battle. Waterloo ended Napoleon's dream. Europe was free, or at least it believed it was. But for Thomas Hale, peace was a stranger. When he returned home, the sound of battle followed him. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing phantom drums. The clatter of a cart on cobblestone sounded like cannon fire. The villagers called him Hero Hale, but he felt hollow. The wars had taken something he could never get back. His mother had died, his village had changed, and the quiet fields seemed unbearable. So when the British Army offered him a post in India in 1824, Thomas accepted. "If peace will not have me," he said, "then let me serve where war still lives." The heat of India was unlike anything he had known. The air shimmered, the jungles breathed with life and death. The British were now fighting the Burmese Empire, a new enemy in a new world. Disease and hunger killed more men than bullets. But Thomas, older now, endured. At the Battle of Danube, 1825, the British attacked a fortified Burmese stronghold, commanded by a fierce general named Mahabandula. The air was thick with smoke and insects. The British guns pounded the walls for hours, but the Burmese did not yield. Thomas led a small group through the swamp to flank the fortress. They waded through waist-deep mud and the stench of decay. When the Burmese spotted them, musket fire erupted like lightning. A bullet grazed Thomas's shoulder. Another struck his pack. He kept moving, shouting orders, until they reached the gates. He was the first to climb the wall, hauling himself up with bloodied hands. When the fortress finally fell, Thomas collapsed beside a cannon, unconscious from loss of blood. He awoke 3 days later, his arm bandaged, the fortress captured. The doctor told him he was lucky. Thomas only smiled faintly. "Luck again," he whispered. "She's running out." That was his fifth battle. He returned to England once more, weary and aged beyond his years. He tried to live quietly by the sea, but the world had other plans. In 1854, the Crimean War began. The British Army, short on veterans, called for old soldiers to train new recruits. Thomas, now 67, volunteered. "I've outlived kings," he said. "Might as well outlive another war." In Crimea, he was supposed to stay behind the lines, but when cholera and chaos swept the camps, Thomas refused to remain idle. He tended the wounded, helped bury the dead, and comforted boys who were barely 18. Then one freezing night, the Russians launched a surprise assault near Sevastopol. The young recruits panicked. Thomas seized a rifle and limped to the barricades. "Hold fast," he shouted. "The line doesn't break." The recruits rallied, firing until dawn. When the attack finally ended, Thomas was found sitting by a cannon, shivering from exhaustion. "We held," he whispered before fainting. He would recover, but barely. That was his 6th battle. He retired again, this time for good. The army gave him a medal, but he never wore it. He lived by the sea near Portsmouth, watching ships drift toward the horizon. Sometimes children would ask about his scars, and he would smile. I fought too many ghosts to remember all their names. But fate had one more test for him. In 1861, the world erupted again, not in Europe this time, but across the Atlantic. The American Civil War raged in the newspapers, and Thomas, now in his 70s, followed every story. "They're fighting their own Waterloo," he said to the dock workers, "but this one will break more than armies, it will break hearts." That winter, cholera struck Portsmouth. The townspeople panicked, but Thomas, too stubborn to rest, volunteered at the infirmary. He worked for days without sleep, helping the sick, carrying the dead, whispering prayers over strangers. When the disease finally claimed him, the doctor said he wouldn't last the night. But Thomas had defied death too many times to surrender easily. "Not yet," he rasped. "Not tonight." And somehow, miraculously, he lived. Again. He never spoke of it as a victory. He called it mercy. "I've survived 7 battles," he told a nurse once, "but not because I was brave, because I was needed to remember those who weren't so lucky." Thomas Hale died peacefully in 1873 at 86 years old. In his trunk, they found 7 small tokens: a musket ball from Relica, a torn flag from Talavera, a shattered button from Salamanca, a rusted bayonet from Waterloo, a Burmese coin, a Crimean medal, and a small wooden cross from Portsmouth. 7 symbols of survival, 7 echoes of a life lived between silence and thunder. His grave lies near the sea, unmarked except for a single line etched by a friend. He remembered. And sometimes when the wind howls across the cliffs of Portsmouth, sailors say you can still hear it, the faint rhythm of marching boots, the echo of a heart that refused to die. Maybe it's just the sea, or maybe it's the soul of Thomas Hale, the soldier who survived 7 battles. The next dawn was pale and quiet, as though the earth itself hesitated to breathe after the bloodshed. Thomas awoke with the metallic taste of death still clinging to the air. Around him lay a carpet of bodies, men he had eaten, laughed, and prayed with only hours ago. The morning sun turned their uniforms into patches of rust and crimson. He was alive again, and he didn't know why. He walked among the fallen, collecting dog tags, closing eyes, whispering a prayer for each. In the distance, cannon smoke still lingered like ghosts refusing to leave the battlefield. When the call came to regroup, Thomas turned and followed it, not because of duty, but because there was nowhere else to go. Years passed, and the soldier who survived Salamanca became a symbol within his regiment. They called him Lucky Hale. But Thomas knew better. Each time he lived, he carried more ghosts within him. By 1854, when the Crimean War erupted, he was no longer young. His hands trembled when he wrote, and his eyes, once sharp as a hawk's, now flickered like candles in wind. Yet he volunteered again. "You've done your share," his old commander warned him. "Why go?" Thomas smiled faintly. "Because I've survived too much to stop now." The voyage to Crimea was harsh. Frozen decks, spoiled rations, seas that rolled like living beasts. Men vomited and prayed in equal measure. When they reached Balaclava, the smell of rot and fear already hung in the air. The British camp was chaos. Disease spreading faster than bullets, medical tents overflowing, and supply wagons sinking into mud. Thomas joined the 93rd Highlanders, a regiment famed for its discipline and ferocity. He had no kilt, but the Scots accepted him nonetheless. "You've seen war," they said. "You'll do." Then came the Battle of Balaclava, October 1854. The morning was quiet, too quiet. From the ridge, Thomas could see the Russian cavalry massing below, ranks of steel and horses stretching like a living tide. Then the order came. Hold the line, no trenches, no walls, no retreat, just a thin red line of men standing shoulder to shoulder facing thousands. The Russian charge began, a thunder that shook the earth. The Highlanders fired, reloaded, fired again. Horses crashed, men screamed, sabers flashed. When the smoke cleared, the Russians had broken and fled. The line held, and Thomas once again was among the living. That night, while tending to a wounded comrade, Thomas realized his hands no longer trembled. "You're not afraid anymore," the man said weakly. Thomas didn't answer, because it wasn't courage that filled him. It was emptiness. He would go on to fight at Inkerman and Sebastopol, surviving both. He learned to sleep standing, to eat without tasting, to kill without remembering faces. By the war's end, he had survived 4 battles. But history wasn't done with him. In 1861, war came again, this time not in Europe, but across the Atlantic. The American Civil War had erupted, tearing a nation in half. Thomas was 50 now, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes like cold stone. He might have stayed in England, but when he read of the wounded at Antietam, of the young dying for causes they barely understood, something in him stirred. He boarded a ship to New York and enlisted with the Union Army under a false name, Henry Wallace. No one asked about his past. War rarely cared who you used to be. At Gettysburg, Thomas saw the old nightmare return. The air was thick with powder and prayer. The sound of cannon fire rolled like God's own thunder. On the second day, as the Confederates stormed Little Round Top, Thomas and his regiment were ordered to hold the flank. He led the charge down the hill, bayonet fixed, shouting words he no longer believed. When the smoke cleared, his regiment was gone. Out of 200, 19 remained standing. Thomas was one of them. After Gettysburg, he wandered. His letters went unanswered, his medals forgotten. The war ended, but peace never came. He worked as a farmhand, a railway guard, a man without history. Yet fate, cruel as ever, was not done with him. By 1879, Thomas was in South Africa, lured by promises of work guarding supply lines for the British Army. Instead, he found himself caught in the Anglo-Zulu War. At Rorke's Drift, a tiny outpost defended by barely 150 men, he once again faced the impossible. The Zulus came like a wave of living fire, thousands against a handful. Bullets ran out, Bayonets broke, and still the men fought. Thomas moved through smoke and flame, hauling the wounded, dousing fires, firing until his rifle barrel burned his hands. When the dawn came, the ground was littered with bodies, Zulu and British alike. The survivors stood stunned, unable to believe they still breathed. That was his 6th battle. Later, as the survivors were decorated for valor, Thomas refused the medal. "I didn't win anything," he said softly. "I just didn't die." He might have ended his days there, an old soldier haunted but alive. Yet history's cruel hand had one more test. In 1899, when the Second Boer War began, Thomas was an old man of 75, too old to fight, yet he volunteered as a medic, tending to men young enough to be his grandsons. "You've cheated death enough times," the army doctor laughed. "You think he's forgotten you?" Thomas only smiled. At Spion Kop, he worked under relentless shell fire, dragging wounded men from the slopes. The air was thick with screams and the crack of Mauser rifles. When the hill was lost and the British retreated, Thomas stayed behind to help the last wounded soldier. A shell exploded nearby, throwing him to the ground. His hearing vanished, his vision blurred. When he awoke, the battle was over. He lay beneath the bodies of those he tried to save, half buried in earth and ash. That was the 7th time he should have died. He was found 3 days later, delirious but alive. The army doctor who examined him whispered, "You've survived 7 battles. You're either blessed or cursed." Thomas didn't answer. He just stared at the sky, where vultures circled lazily above the battlefield. After the war, he disappeared from military roles. Some said he returned to England. Others claimed he died in a South African hospice. But one story, told by a nurse decades later, spoke of an old man with trembling hands who would sit by the window and whisper the names of the dead. When asked what he was thinking, he'd reply, "I'm just counting the ones who didn't make it." The world moved on. Wars came and went. But in dusty archives and forgotten diaries, his name sometimes appeared, a ghost of ink among the lists of the lost. Historians later pieced fragments together. Letters signed T. Hale, dispatches from Salamanca, field notes from Crimea, a faded photograph from Rorke's Drift showing a weary man with eyes that had seen too much. And so his legend lived on, not as a hero, not as a myth, but as a man who endured when all reason said he shouldn't. Because history is not only written by those who win, but also by those who survive. If you ever visit an old war memorial and see a name too faded to read, think of him, the soldier who crossed 7 hells and walked out breathing, not for glory, not for empire, but because life, even in its cruelest moments, refused to let him go. And somewhere in the silence between cannon fire and dawn, his story still whispers a reminder that survival is not luck nor fate, but the quiet, stubborn heartbeat that refuses to stop.